Welcome back to AWS On Air. We are live here in Washington, D.C. We are at the 2023 AWS DC Summit. Live, we can see we are in the expo hall. You can see all of the conference attendees walking around. And my name is Jeff Rushak. I am a senior solutions architect on the DoD Air Force team. And I am joined by Eric Weber today. And we're going to talk a little bit about EC2, managing EC2, and Systems Manager. So Eric, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Sure. So hi everyone, my name is Eric Weber. I'm a Senior Specialist Solutions Architect here at AWS. I've been with AWS a little bit over 7 years now. We primarily focus on helping customers adopt some of those cloud operations related services like AWS Systems Manager, Config, CloudTrail, and Audit Manager.
Awesome. And with EC2, what makes it hard to manage EC2 instances?
Well, first, when we start focusing, just deploying out a couple of EC2, that's probably easy enough.
Yeah.
You only have 10, maybe 20, 50. Once we start going above that, then you start needing to think about, okay, where are these EC2? What accounts are they in? What regions are they in? Having the entire AWS organizations bring that in. So having these instances across all of these different locations, then we also need to think about, all right, how do we remotely manage them? Can we patch them, gather inventory data, deploy out, agents like the CloudWatch agent, start gathering metrics. It's all these different pieces that we need to put together and think about how can we orchestrate this in an automated way.
Yeah, a lot of times, so I mentioned I'm an SA for the Air Force, so I work with a lot of customers in GovCloud, and one of the most popular questions I get is, so I'm set up with my environment and I need to do some Yum updates.
Yep.
So how can, what are some options to do updates with EC2 instances in a VPC that maybe doesn't have an internet gateway or direct internet access?
Yeah, so what we'll be taking a look at later on in the demo, one of the best things about AWS Systems Manager is that can work in fully isolated subnets and VPCs. So Systems Manager, you can deploy out VPC endpoints to be able to enable that remote connectivity so that those EC2 instances, they can still check in with Systems Manager and be able to be accessible for remote management. So you can push out that patching operation.
Yeah, and just so in case the viewers don't know what VPC endpoints are, it's basically, normally when anything calls an AWS service, we always say how it's basically an API call, but generally without any changes, that API call is to the internet. So basically to call any AWS service without any extra work, you would need internet access. But if you don't have if you don't have internet access on your VPCs, you can set up a VPC endpoint, which would basically change your routing, make some slight DNS changes so your machine knows anything, for example, Systems Manager-wise, it would get rerouted to the endpoint and privately access that service.
Yep, exactly. Go directly to the service endpoint rather than out over the public internet.
So a lot of folks, when you start learning about AWS, you learn about Systems Manager, like Patch Manager, and doing all these extra things. But the first step in all these demos is installing the Systems Manager agent.
Yep.
And so you talked a little, you can bootstrap things, and we always do a demo with user data to install that agent. But how do we, what are some best practices to make sure that all of our EC2 instances are configured with Systems Manager?
Yeah, so when we're talking about the Systems Manager and the Systems Manager agent, when we're talking about launching EC2 instances, it is pre-installed on a wide variety of our AWS provided AMIs, so you may already have it in place.
Like Amazon Linux 2 in the latest version?
Yeah, Amazon Linux 2, all of our Windows, Ubuntu, SUSE, those will all have the SSM agent pre-installed and ready to go.
Great, all right, so do you have a demo we can see some of Systems Manager in action and then see what you can and can't do, et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah, let's go ahead and jump right over into it.
Let's bring that up.
So over here in my AWS account, I have 3 different instances. Just to talk about the registration process just a little bit more, when we're talking about registering an EC2 instance, the feature that we'll take a look at in just a moment kind of does this way, but normally you would need to install the Systems Manager agent, go over to the EC2 console, and attach an IAM role. So here we can see the IAM role that I've attached to it. This is going to, or this is what enables the Systems Manager agent to have permissions to be able to register itself and then be accessible for this remote command. So a feature that we launched earlier this year is called default host management configuration. And the way that this changes this process is that it removes that requirement to actually attach that IAM role directly to the EC2.
All right, let me stop you for a second. Even though you're painting this picture of this is a step you don't have to do, assigning that role to the EC2 instance, that's there for a reason, because we talk about the least privilege.
Yep.
And we want to make sure that only things can do what they need to do. So how is this new feature still aligned with that?
So, when we're talking about least privilege in mind, that policy that we would end up attaching for our EC2 instances, we can make it very low level so that it's only really going to check in with Systems Manager. We want to gather inventory data. We want to perform patch scans.
Yep.
Some of these baseline configurations and guardrails that we need to put in place for our environment, we can now have that be enabled as sort of that low level default. Go ahead and have our instances check in and be available. If there are those scenarios where our applications or workloads need that more specific permissions, maybe to RDS, Dynamo, S3, we would still want to go with attaching that IAM role directly.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, so can you explain how this new feature works?
Yeah, so like I mentioned, it's called default host management. If you go to the Fleet Manager console and you see that some of those EC2 instances are not checking in, you even get this little banner that's going to go ahead and bring that up for you.
So these are all three that have the roles attached to the old way, correct?
Exactly,
okay.
Yep. So these are the 3 instances that I have that IAM role directly attached to. I have 5 other instances that do not have that role. So there's a few different ways, of course, to go ahead and enable this. We're taking a look at within the Managed Instance console itself. So there is an IAM role. It's going to exist within your account. Again, we're just selecting that basic policy that I believe is the Managed Instance core that's going to help the registration of those instances. So I'll go ahead and hit configure. This is going to enable that setting for my account. Now, of course, since we are just doing a live demo, for 2 of these instances that I'm going to enable that process on, I'm just going to go ahead and reboot them so it kicks it up a little bit faster.
Okay.
The agent itself, if it's not able to check in, we're not just going to continually make calls. We're going to go into a hibernation state. So eventually we'll see these other instances check in. But just to speed things up a little bit, I'm just going to go ahead and perform a reboot.
Sure.
So this will probably take about 30 seconds to a minute for those notes to actually go ahead and check in with Systems Manager now. But in just a couple seconds, we should see those flow in. So while we're waiting for those, like I mentioned, there's a few different ways to enable this default host management configuration. We were taking a look at that setting that I just enabled through this account management. Now that is on a per account, per region. If I were to log in here, go through that. But you can always enable this from the CLI or from the API as well.
Okay.
So the blog post that we ended up publishing back in March, this also has a sample CloudFormation template. So from here, from that template, you can go ahead and deploy out and enable default host management configuration as well. So when we're talking about it from multi-account, multi-region perspective, what we can use is CloudFormation stack sets to go ahead and deploy out this template and then enable that default host management across our accounts and regions. So let's go ahead. Yep, so it looks like 2 of those instances are now checking in. Again, so if we were to go back to the EC2 console, DHCM1, if I pull that up to the security tab, again, I don't have that IAM role, but our agent is still able to register itself and make itself available for all of the remote management capabilities that Systems Manager provides. So on this left-hand side, I can now go ahead and perform that patch scan, perform that remote management, connect to the instance directly.
Run command, runs all those things.
Exactly.
So how is it actually doing it?
So some of the requirements in order for the agent to be able to check in, there is an agent version that is required, a minimum agent version. So
sure.
If you do have instances that are already launched, with an older agent version, you may need to go ahead and update those or just install the latest version. The other major requirement is that it requires access to IMDS v2, so metadata version 2.
Okay, gotcha.
So that is something that is available for those EC2 instances. If I were to go over to my instance settings and then check that, we can either leave it as optional for IMDS v2 or we can flip it over to required depending on your workload. Now, if your instances are using IMDS v1, you don't want to just flip this over to required. That is a little bit more of a planning process. But as long as it's available and it's listed as optional, then your instance can access that requirement. So the main requirements, again, are going to be that minimum agent version and accessibility to IMDS v2.
Gotcha. Well, I see our instances 1 and 2 showed up now.
Yep. So here, now I can go ahead and just perform any of those standard, fleet manager related tool sets. When I select an instance, I can view a couple different things. We'll just go ahead and flip over to the performance counters. If I need some immediate input or insight into some of these common, counters like CPU utilization, disk input, output, what is the memory usage or network traffic, all of this information is just being streamed directly to the console at this point. So it's all, in real time as far as some of this availability. If I go over to the processes section, this is going to make that connection to my managed instance and stream back to me what are those currently live running processes on that node. And then I can go and interact with them as well. So I can start up new processes, kill them. If I if I suspect something's going wrong, maybe I want to go ahead and terminate one of those running processes.
Yeah. So what you made a change to instances 1 and 2, did a reboot, and they came up. How do you get this to connect when you create a new EC2 instance from scratch?
Yeah, so if I were to go and launch a brand new EC2 instance over from the console, again, all that I would really need to make sure is that my VPC has network connectivity to those Systems Manager endpoints. So again, whether that's over the public internet or through those private.
Yeah, okay.
Yep. And then there is an agent version requirement. Now that can either be pre-baked in, so if we're launching an instance that does not have the SSM agent pre-installed, we might still use something like user data. But again, the ideal way is to pre-bake it into our golden image ahead of time, so that we have the agent and we know it's there in place at launch.
Okay, perfect.
So probably some other things just to show real quick. One other thing that I wanted to highlight is for our Windows nodes, we also have availability within the Fleet Manager console to open up remote desktop directly to them. Now, some of the major benefits of this is that because we are using Systems Manager as that connection point, as far as our security groups go, we actually don't have to allow any inbound rules for RDP. That's the standard way, is making that port open. Then we have to worry about the security of that as well.
Yeah, as soon as you do that, there is an attack vector.
Exactly,
yes.
Yeah. So whether we lock it down to the appropriate IP addresses, just making sure that all of that is available. But when you're using Session Manager, the agent itself is working on outbound HTTPS or 443 to our endpoints. So as long as we're allowing that outbound and that ephemeral traffic back in, that's all that we need from our security group side of things. So in here, I'm now connected, through just a standard RDP prompt. And I can go ahead and interact with my instance just the same as if I had that full connection from my local machine. But that, again, would make that requirement of opening up my instance. And
yeah, that's wonderful.
And so I wanted to highlight this because both default host management configuration as well as this RDP functionality, they're available in all commercial regions as well as GovCloud. So you can go ahead and get started right away.
Yeah, and I don't mean to be speechless, but I was watching your demo, so this is really exciting. Yeah, and it's important as we as we talk to customers and people learn AWS, how important Systems Manager is and all of the key things. You've just demoed like we've seen this before, so it's like, oh yeah, run command, big deal. Oh yeah, remote desktop. But all of these Systems Manager is sort of like unsung hero that does a ton of stuff that makes a lot of people's lives and operations easier.
Yep. Yeah, so when we're talking about like the RDP functionality, another thing that I'll go ahead and showcase real quick is actually another aspect of it, just starting up a generic terminal session. So when we're talking about Linux instances, SSHing to the box, that has the requirements of sharing out those PEM keys or SSH keys across your environment, worrying about who has access to those SSH keys as well.
Yeah, and probably like folks who learned AWS and cloud computing probably 5-6 years ago, that was something everyone went through, was to start up your first EC2 instance and then figure out how to get PuTTY to work, how to get your PEM key, and if you're on Windows, convert that PEM key with pagent and all that stuff. And because this wasn't that available, but now we can PuTTY right there or open an SSH console right there.
Yep, and we can go ahead initiate a session against this managed instances. I'm ready to go. I can start typing commands in real time. I also enabled logging for this as well. So this is actually streaming over into CloudWatch right now. So I open up my CloudWatch log group. I can see the command that I just entered, date pwd. If I were to go back to that. just do my standard echo hello world. I can go back over to CloudWatch and near instantaneously, I now have that command being written out as well.
That's wonderful.
So, Session Manager and this CloudWatch log streaming can be enabled, so you can always go back and reflect, what kind of commands were entered during a given session.
So as folks are learning more about Systems Manager, is there any resources that you typically point people towards? We've talked a lot about the observability workshop, so I don't know if there's a Systems Manager workshop or something that you point people to learn more.
Yeah, so there is a workshop available. So if you look in Workshop Studios, it's called Getting Started with Centralized Operations Management. So when we're talking about AWS Systems Manager, we're talking about those operations that scale across all these accounts, across all these regions. While we're focusing on EC2 instances today, the Systems Manager agent can also be installed in on-prem data centers or even other servers and VMs in other clouds. So you can remotely manage all of these disparate environments using a single tool set.
That's wonderful. Well, Eric, we're at time, so thank you very much for showing us this new feature of Systems Manager. And thanks a lot,
Yeah,
man.
thanks for having me.
Yeah.
It's been great.
So we're here live in Washington, D.C. at the 2023 AWS DC Summit. I'm Jeff Marushak, and we'll be back momentarily with our next segment.